Well, good evening, church. All right, thank you. If you will stand with us as we sing House of the Lord.
We worship the God who was. We worship the God who is. We worship the God who evermore will be. He opened the prison doors. He parted the raging sea. My God, He holds a victory. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise. We sing to the God who heals. We sing to the God who saves. We sing to the God who always makes a way. 'Cause He hung up on that cross, then He rose up from that grave. My God, still rolling stones away. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. 'Cause we were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. We were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise.
Woo! You can be seated.
Thank you, worship team. Colby, thank you, man. That's awesome. I love that song, and I love this doing it together. Thank you for being here to worship together. Just got this from a young girl as I was leaving the office here, running in here just a few minutes ago. Madeline, she gave me this cross that she had crafted for me. I remember Madeline coming up to me, even though she wasn't in here because she would dismiss for jam, but she knew that we earlier this year were talking about the gifts of the Spirit and how we can serve and how all of us have a gift and how all of us, it's incumbent upon us to serve in some way. And I remember her coming to me, and she got her mom to come talk to me about it while she was there with her. How can I serve? And I remember talking to her about some things, about some ways that even kids can serve and do serve, and how they honor God and serve one another in the house of God. And so one of the things I said to her, and this is evidence of it, and I know she doesn't remember this, as she wanted to bless me with this today, but one of the things we talked about with with Madeline was her making things and going up to adults and gifting them. I told her a lot of kids do that. Kids have done that to me over the years, and it's always stuff that I cherish. I've got me a little cross here as an encouragement made to me by a girl. Listen, let me tell you something. There's a way for you to serve, and you don't have to serve in an official capacity. You don't have to wear some hat or some name tag that says, this is what I do every week at the church. Those are good, and we need people stepping up in those ways too, but there are ways that all of us can serve. I had this one lady at my first senior pastorate in Florida, a senior lady who felt like she couldn't do anything. She's like, I can't sing on the stage, I can't teach, there's nothing that what has God called me to do? And I said to her, what is it that you love to do? What are you passionate about? She's like, well, I cook. I bake cakes and breads and all this. And so I didn't have to say anything to her. Next thing you know, that lady is just blessing people in the church all throughout the year, not just on their birthdays and such, but any old time she just bring cakes. I wanted to bless your family with this cake. And so that was her way of ministry. God's called you to serve in one or more ways, and I hope that you will do that. A couple of quick announcements. The business directory, the hard copies are made available here. They're in the back. They're at the entrances. If you hadn't already grabbed one, you can see. This is all of the businesses that are owned by Cave Springers. This is a handful of them, those who responded over the last little more than a month who were asking. And so you can check out these businesses and look who the owners are and pray for them and sponsor them and support them. And ask them how they're doing, how their business is going when you see them at church. That's cool for us to do as a family of believers together. And then Wednesday's food and fellowships, they go from 5:30 to 6:15. So we're going to start, and I think we totally beat that tonight, and I think most nights we do get out of there around that time. But we're just going to make it clear that let's all get up out of there by 6:15. I think most of us get here early enough anyhow, by 5:30. Some of you beat that and get here a little bit earlier than that. But if we get out by 6:15, then we have a crew of folks who can get a little bit done. Sometimes they can get the bulk of it done. I think tonight they finished it up before we started here at 6:30. But they can get a little bit of it done in those 15 minutes and then go back to it at 7:30. Now, some can't do that. Some can't go back and clean the dishes and stack the chairs and put away all the items and wipe they can't do that because some have to be home before it starts to get dark, and understandable. So if you're willing to be part of the 7:30 cleanup crew, then Miss Annette back here would love to talk to you. If you can help us on Wednesdays for maybe 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes at 7:30. So you get out of your group, maybe get out a little bit after 7:30, but we get out of your group and you head over there, and if there's a little bit more work to be done, we can all do it together in a matter of minutes. That way, at 6:30, nobody is lingering back there and missing God's word in here. And then that way, when they get to the groups, they know what's been discussed, and they can jump in and discuss it with you. And so that's most important. And so we'll put the cleaning on the back burner where it needs to be. And I know that there'll be some folks that are going to rise up perhaps and say, hey, I can help at 7:30 for 15 minutes before I head out of here. If that's you, Annette would love to talk to you. Tonight we start a series, Breaking Bad Habits, because bad habits so closely. And some of us, some of those sins and those bad habits have become a part of who we are. That they cling so closely, they become attached to us, a part of us, if you will. And so it says, let us run with endurance the race that's set before us after we get rid of these sins, these bad habits. 2 Peter 2:19 says, for whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. And so if you've got some bad habits or a habit that's not glorifying God, that's besmirching your testimony as a Christ follower, and it's overcome you, you can't get rid of it, you're enslaved to that. You're in bondage. Talk about being set free. Well, you're not set free because you're encumbered by those bad habits. And so we need to annihilate them. Paul said, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated or mastered by anything. 1 Corinthians 6:12. He says, I'm not gonna participate in any bad habits. No habit is going to gain mastery over me and make me its slave. And he talked about some things being lawful or permissible, but not beneficial, especially not to do in front of other folks that would cause them to stumble. So he says, nothing's going to master me if something causes, takes glory from God, or if it causes a stumbling block between me and somebody else regarding my testimony, I'm going to get rid of it, and it's not going to hang on me. It's not going to be a sin that so easily entangles and hangs on me and ruins my testimony. Nothing will master me. I hope that a lot of us are wanting that in our lives. But I know this, sadly, some of us are happy and content being dominated by sinful habits. We've grown used to these sins, and so some of us coddle them. We coddle them, we protect them at all cost. And I've mentioned this before, but I do liken it to a spiritual form of Stockholm Syndrome. You've heard of that. That is a real scenario where folks can actually begin to want to protect and wanting to serve those who've taken them captive, even in a violent way. And so sometimes we're so engrossed in our sin, we coddle it, we protect it even. We don't want it to go. We don't want our bad habits to leave. I pray that if you're there, and I think a handful of Christ followers are there, I pray that we change viewpoints about those sinful habits as we learn that they grieve God when we don't deal with them and get rid of them. And they cause stumbling blocks before others because we can't keep everything hidden. Even when we can keep some of our habits hidden from others, it still, whether they know it or not, affects our ministry and testimony unto them. There's just something not right, even if they can't understand what it is in your life that you're hiding from everybody. When you hide sinful habits and you coddle them and say, I'm going to keep this one because this is precious to me, and I've learned to deal with it. Now it's a part of who I am. And Stockholm Syndrome, bad news. Let's change our viewpoints about these sinful habits and get rid of them. And then you have some of us on the flip side who aren't necessarily happy and content with being enslaved to sin, but we're not willing to do much about it. And I believe that this is a lot of Christ followers. A lot of us don't want to lift a finger and do much work. So we'll pray, God, take it away. God, take this desire away. I don't want to sin anymore because, yes, it grieves you, and yes, it causes some grief elsewhere. But God, just take the desire away. I know a lot of folks guilty of doing just that because several things. That's easy to do. It's easy to pray, God, you do it. You take away this desire. And it doesn't require effort and sacrifice on your part or my part when we do that. And then thirdly, when God doesn't take it away, we can blame Him rather than ourselves. Oh, this habit that I keep doing, it's His fault. I asked Him to take the desire away, and He hasn't. So it's on Him. Whether we say that or think that outright or not, that's behind the scenes sometimes in our minds. We can just blame God and shift it away from ourselves for doing nothing to annihilate our bad habits. But let me explain to you why I believe God doesn't take away our desires as easily as we'd want Him to. And I felt this way as a teenager. This dawned on me, and I hope this will make sense to you. But I mentioned a little bit of it Sunday real quickly. But if we're at point A and we're going to get to point B, and then that bridge, crossing that is going to be hard to lose that bad habit of getting from A to B. And we say, God, just do it. And He comes and babies us and picks us up and moves us from A to B. And then are we physically ready to move from B to C? Can we do what He's called us to do? Can we be the strong Christ followers in Him that He's called us to be? To do the missions that He calls us on? Sometimes they're uncomfortable and painful, those missions. When He coddles us and moves us from A to B and then from B to C. I mean, if you pick up a child and our youngest one, Grayson, if we never did anything but hold him, then him learning to walk at the right time would be hard to do if all we do is pick him up and take him everywhere. And so God doesn't pick you up and move you from A to B because you're praying, God, just take the desire away. How easy that would be. Instead, God wants us to do some things. He wants us to go to work at what Romans 8:13 says, putting to death the deeds of the body. Laying aside every sin and putting to death the deeds of the body takes effort. Praying to God now and crying out to God and letting His Spirit empower you, that is essential. And you'll hear us start talking about that, especially next week. So don't get me wrong, I'm not removing God from the equation. That is paramount. We will cry out to God. We will let His Spirit aid us and help us and empower us as we defeat bad habits. But the starting point and the constant least common denominator in the equation is you. You're it. If you are going to overcome your bad habits, it's you and the work that you're going to do and the sacrifices that you're going to make and doing the hard work that's uncomfortable, even as you have withdrawal symptoms. And you can have withdrawal symptoms on everything under the sun, not just drugs. Whatever your bad habit might be, whether it be a sexual bad habit or an emotional attachment you've got, or you're addicted to substances, you can have withdrawal symptoms, and it can be tough, but we're going to talk about how to deal with that in the weeks ahead. So the question is, are you willing to learn, I believe, 5 steps that God's Word lays out to annihilate bad habits? And so we're going to read the passage today before we just split into our groups. We're going to read the passage, Judges 3:12 through 30, and I hope he's ready for that on the screen. That is excellent. I'm glad it's ready for us. We'll begin step 1 of 5 next week. There's 5 crucial steps, and this passage, we're going to reach into this passage and extrapolate all 5 of them. Before we get into this passage tonight, a little background before we look at Judges 3:12 through 30. The judges were men and one woman, Deborah, who were leaders and warriors and deliverers of God's people many thousands of years ago and after Moses and Joshua. But before Samuel anointed Saul as king over Israel, there were several hundred years wherein God would often raise up a judge. He'd raise up a deliverer to set His people free from bondage. So you're thinking, Pastor, I thought they were free. I mean, God released them from Egypt. You know, He used Moses and they left Egypt. And so the Israelites were on an up and down roller coaster, if you will, with God. They were free then, but then they would turn and go after false gods, and God would allow them to experience, they'd experience blessings and peace and freedom, then they'd turn and God would allow them to be suffering under the hands of pagan kings, and they would serve as slaves. And then they'd cry out to God, their one true love. And then God would come back and rescue them and deliver them, only for that to last for a season. Sometimes it would last between 15 to 80 years. It'd be a brief period of time or a little bit longer, but then they'd go back to false gods, and God would allow them to fall back under slavery again until they cried out to Him and meant business and were deciding that they're going to do away with their sins, as hard as that would be. And then God would allow freedom and blessings to come to them again. And so where we're going to pick it up here during the series, we're going to look at the second judge, the second deliverer, Ehud. God raised up Ehud at a most desperate time. And so look with me at Judges 3:12 through 30. It says, and the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon. Eglon's a pagan king. Strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and he went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. That's the city of Jericho. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years, because sin has consequences, as we just said. They fell into slavery because they had left God and served after, went after false gods, and so they are going to be slaves at this point for 18 years. Verse 15, then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. This is about after 18 years of slavery. They cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud. Ehud in the Hebrew means powerful. He raised up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera. Gera means stranger or traveler. The Benjaminite, a left-handed man was Ehud. That's rare, and he was a warrior on top of it. And so it was very rare. In fact, almost never would you have a warrior who was a lefty, who held his sword in the left hand. But this is going to come into play a little bit later. So the people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. They were sending tribute. Tribute was possessions or currency or crops. It also included often slave workers, which could be individuals or entire families. They would send tribute. They're owned. They're slaves by this pagan king, and so to appease him and to keep him from annihilating all of them, they would they'd offer bribes. They would send money and people as slaves, and they would do that either yearly or quarterly. And so, as in dystopian films that are sometimes, relatively popular today, the TWD episode, you have tribute. They would send tribute to Negan on that TV show, and they would send, there were slaves to him as he owned what they were doing, and they would have to pay him off and bribe him so that he wouldn't annihilate them. They'd have to give them their best of food and all that stuff. And so maybe you've seen the old movie Hunger Games, and they would have tributes who were people. And so the elites, the upper class elites, for their amusement would take tributes. All the people were their slaves, but people would go up, I think it was yearly on that movie, and fight to the death for the amusement of the upper class elites. They were tributes. And so here you have people who were in slavery. It's akin to, these tributes were akin to bribery. More officially, we could call them taxes, but in an illegal sense. And so gangs in other cities in the United States still use this today, especially outside of the country, especially in Mexico, where you have businesses that have to pay tribute to gang leaders to protect their business so that they don't allow people to come and annihilate them. And so this is the tribute that they are, as slaves to King Eglon, they're having to give him probably possessions and people. Verse 16, and Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges. Well, this was going to be well hidden. This sword. It's got two edges. It's not the right kind of sword by their standards for that time. They would use large curved swords with one edge of it was sharpened, and a smaller double-edged sword was very unique. Just as unique as Ehud himself, this Mr. Lefty, as we're going to see more of the uniqueness on how God uses him, this left-handed warrior. And so he makes himself this weird, this cool and unique sword, a cubit in length, so not so large. It's going to be this one probably straight sword, double-edged. Let's hear more about it. And he bound it to his right thigh under his clothes. So it's unique. It's going to be well hidden under his clothes. It's going to be a place that's not noticed by the guards of Moab. The guards aren't going to look there. They're not going to check the man's right thigh. They're not going to check, because all warriors are right-handers, and you draw like this. You draw the big sickle sword out like this. And so to have a sword tucked away on his right side, this lefty, nobody's even going to think about that. They're not going to know he's got that weapon hidden away, and that's all by design. So it was tucked up under his clothes. Verse 17, he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, and now Eglon was a very fat man. He tells us that because he's physically fat, but he's also figuratively fat, and that he is the king taking tribute. He's getting fat literally and otherwise off of what belongs to others who were his slaves. Eglon was a very fat man, and when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute, but he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he, the king, commanded silence, and it's a Hebrew word that really means scat, like leave us, everybody, out of here, I want to hear this. Scat and leave us alone, he says to all of his guards. He says, silence, and all of his attendants went out from his presence, and Ehud came up to him. And as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber, this was a summer palace that he had, and he's taking it easy out on the top deck of the palace that he was at. It says, Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And so this king rose from his seat. He's probably thinking, this is going to be good. This is worth standing for. I want to hear this. He's like, I want to hear this oracle from God, the God of the Israelites. He was probably amused by this. Hey, let's hear what one of my slaves is going to tell me about his God. I want to hear this. He had no fear, because what could a single man with no weapons do to this king anyhow? So he sends everybody out, including his guards, and he stands up and he's getting ready to hear. And all of his attendants went out, and Ehud came up to him and says, I got a message for you. Verse 21, and Ehud reached with his left hand took the sword from his right thigh and he thrust it into the belly of the king. And the hilt, verse 22, the hilt, because he made this special weapon with no handle on it. He didn't need a handle for protection. He made it so it could just go all the way in. He wasn't going to pull it out and reuse it. He made this sword so it would go in. Look at verse 22. It says, the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed in over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly. And the dung came out. So some translations, as I told you before, about a couple years ago, they leave that out. The NIV 84 leaves it out altogether. The NIV 2011 says the bowels discharged. That's doable. We'll talk about why in a second. The King James Version says the dirt came out. The New King James says the entrails came out. The New American Standard says the refuse came out. The ESV, which tries to be as accurate as possible and the word for word, says the dung came out. Now that is in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it says literally the dung came out of this man when he was stabbed in the belly. Some people clean that up thinking we don't need to hear it, but I believe that anything that's in the original Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic, we need to know about it. And there's a reason that is going to come into play here in just a moment. The dung came out. Look at verse 23. Then Ehud went out into the porch. Now, the porch is a weird Hebrew word. It's another hapax legomenon. It's the only time it is used in the entire Bible. It's probably a word, most scholars believe it's a word for latrine or toilet. It's a word for the actual hole, the actual thing, the device or the hole in the ground which would serve as the latrine. He went into the area of the latrine, and to sit or be where that hole is, and he closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. This Ehud did after taking the sword and pushing it through the king Eglon. In other words, Ehud escaped down the hole of a toilet. He's up on the upper chamber with this king he has just slain. How is he going to get away without the guards outside? He's locked the doors behind him and the guards are out there waiting on their king. How is he going to get away? He's going to go down the hole of the latrine. Verse 24, when he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely he's relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. Now, the cool chamber is a word for restroom. It's a private area to go for bathroom, restroom purposes. And so they're waiting outside of this. Eglon's anal sphincter had exploded, causing the smell of a bowel movement. That's why it makes sense. That's why you need to hear that the dung came out. Because when he stabbed him with the sword, there would be a smell that, hey, somebody's in there using the restroom. So he escapes down the hole of the latrine. The guards are out there waiting, smelling, thinking, okay, our king is taking a while in the restroom. Surely he's relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. And they waited till they were embarrassed. That's a Hebrew phrase to mean until they were put to shame. They waited so long, and we don't know how long, but it was so long that they felt like shame would come to them, like they should be in there checking on their king. And so much time has passed. Again, we don't know how long, but it was obviously long enough for them to feel embarrassed, for them to feel worried, for them to be ashamed that, hey, we need to get to the king and see what's going on. He's not answering us. He's not unlocking the door. What's going on? Maybe he's got a serious problem. But when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and they opened them, and there lay their Lord dead on the floor. That's why he wasn't answering them. And they learned that now. How much time had elapsed because of a misinterpreted smell? Well, enough time for Ehud to escape, enough time for him to make his way down that hole of the latrine and get after Dodge. Get out of there and get back up with his people who he had already sent off to head back home. He's able to get away from the scene. Verse 26, Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Seirah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. So they went down after him and seized the fords. Now, the fords were shallow areas where people would cross the streams and rivers. They're equivalent to today's bridges. And them seizing the fords is equivalent to what we, the United States, what the military does when we're in a military operation. The first thing they do is take care of the bridges and the airports to gain immediate advantage. So you can stop who comes and goes. You can stop the transporting of goods. You can stop people from fleeing to sanctuary. And that's what they did here, seizing the fords like little, natural bridges through the waters. They seized them so that people that they were fighting couldn't flee to sanctuary and get out of Dodge and get away and spare their lives. So they seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. And not a man escaped. Not one escaped. When God delivers, He delivers. They seized the fords and allowed not one person to flee to sanctuary. Where it says they were all strong, able-bodied men that they killed, I looked at several Hebrew words in regard to this. One of them is another Hebrew word for fat, which gets interpreted here as healthy or robust warriors. They were strong. But it's a different word for than the fat used to describe King Eglon. This word is always a fat of health, a fat of oil, a fat of strong and healthy. It's always used in a very positive sense, and that's what it says here. They were all strong, able-bodied men, and not one of them escaped. It's not like they were just there, killing off old do-nothings who had no strength in them. They were taking out 10,000 of some of the best warriors. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. 80 years they had rest because they decided to do some things. We will talk about, starting with step 1 and then continuing, 5 steps that come from this passage on how to annihilate the bad habits in your life that have you enslaved. They finally, after 18 years, decided to get rid of. They called out to God, and we're going to talk about that next week, crying out to Him in the right way. They called out to God and says, God, we're tired of living in sin and being in bondage. We want to be done. We want to be free from these, these chains. And so if you want the same for yourself, if you want to live in freedom, if you want to live outside of bondage, then be here for the next 5 weeks as we talk about each of the 5 steps, all 5 of them super important. Don't just do 1 or 2 of them. Come and know all 5 of them and do them, and then begin to see, if you employ the steps, if you do what's hard, if you do what's required of you, employ these steps, you will see, I promise you, these bad habits, these areas of slavery over you, you will see them eradicated. And I can't wait for you to begin to live that. Let's talk about this passage in our groups tonight. You are dismissed. Thank you.